Okay, now I think maybe it's a good time to start, I guess. Yes, I mean.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, Pium Chitima.
Good afternoon, Ka. Good afternoon, Will. Good morning. Yeah.
Hi,
Good morning there. It's morning. Good morning there.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon to you.
Nice to see you again. And nice to
you.
see everyone.
Okay, so now I think maybe it's a good time to start, I guess. Okay, and the greeting from Thailand and good afternoon, everyone. As a program supervisor, I'm honored to have you here as our participants in the intellectual event of November under PSU Open Mobility 2022. In this program, our invited speaker will guide you through an interesting topic called Global Citizenship, English Medium Education, and ELT. Before we get into business, let me introduce our two lovely moderators who will be running the session today, Ms. Suchada Pumpuang and Ms. Adnan Dolok. They both hold a Bachelor of Education in English from Prince of Songkla University, Thailand, and they are currently working as English teacher at schools located in southern part of Thailand. Their research interests include English language teaching, especially on issues related to educational provisions in remote areas, English as a lingua franca and English as an international language. Now, I will let our moderators resume the session. So everyone, please welcome Ms. Suchada and Ms. Afnan.
Thank you, Professor Yusuf. Okay, very good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would love to introduce myself again. My name is Suchada Pumpuang from Princess Julapon Science High School, Prang, and I'm here today with my co-moderator.
Okay, so I'm Afnan Dalla. So we are going to be the moderator for the first program of PSU Open Mobility 2022, which mentioned by Dr. Yusuf just now. So for this month, for today's sessions, it will be under the topic of global citizenship, English medium and English language teaching. So once again, thank you very much for having us, especially to Assistant Professor Dr. Yusuf Bunsuk for a very brief introduction.
Indeed, and now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who is going to talk to us about global citizenship, English medium education, and ELT. As an educator teaching English, this is a subject in which we should all be deeply interested because I'm firmly sure that today's presentation will expand our perspective beyond language teaching, as well as another crucial dimension. Our speaker, Will Baker, is an Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics and Director of the Center for Global English at the University of Southampton, UK. His research interests are intercultural and transcultural communication, English as a lingua franca, English medium instruction, intercultural education, intercultural citizenship, and ELT.
Okay, so on top of that, Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker has published and presented internationally in all those areas mentioned by my co-moderator. His recent publications include Transcultural Communication and Global Englishes, co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, author for the monograph Culture and Identity Through English as a Lingua Franca, and the co-editor of the book series Development in ELF, English as a Lingua Franca, and Cambridge Elements in Intercultural Communication.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's proper time for the event to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Associate Professor Will Baker. Please welcome.
Please welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the very nice introduction, Suchada and Afnan. So thank you for that. And thank you to Yusuf for inviting me to come and speak to you again. I'm very happy to be here virtually. I'd be even happier if I was there in person, but hopefully at some point in the future, I can come back in person again. Okay, all right. So I'll just try and share my slides now. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yes,
Yes.
we can see
Yes,
that.
yes.
Okay, good. All right, so the topic of this presentation, or rather the title of this presentation, as has already been explained, is to do with global citizenship, but the title is actually intercultural citizenship, and I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably, which I'll discuss in a bit more detail in a minute. So the title is Intercultural Citizenship and the Internationalization of Higher Education, specifically focusing on the role of ELT for this. So the presentation is going to be divided into 4 areas. So first of all, I'll begin with a quick overview of the rationale and aims for the study that I'm going to describe. So I'm going to talk about a study that was done on this topic for Thai students with the help of Yusuf. In fact, he was part of the research team for that. Then I'll provide a bit of background information. So for those of you not so familiar with the role of intercultural citizenship in language teaching and in internationalization of higher education, I'll go through some of the issues there and talk about why I think ELT is particularly important for intercultural education or intercultural citizenship education. Then the main part of the talk will be looking at the study itself. So presenting an overview of the key findings from the study, discussing some of the issues that the study brings up in terms of intercultural citizenship, English language teaching, and higher education. And then at the end, we'll discuss some of the implications for English language teaching. And then hopefully we should have plenty of time at the end for people to ask questions and also to comment and bring up discussion points for how you think this may or may not be relevant for your teaching and your experiences. So as I said, I'll begin with the rationale and aims that kind of inform the study that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, as I'm sure everyone's very familiar with, there's been an increasing prominence of the intercultural dimensions to internationalization as a result of the internationalization of higher education. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides. They're doing something strange. Okay, yeah. So one of the key ways in which this is being conceptualized is through the notions of learners developing a sense of intercultural or global citizenship during their higher education experiences. And this has also increasingly worked its way into language teaching, particularly through the work of people like Michael Byram. And it's also a general educational concept. So, for example, the United Nations, under their Sustainable Development Goals, under the specific goal of quality education, have global citizenship as one of the aims. So global citizenship is really an idea that's increasingly important within both general education and higher education and language teaching. However, while there's been a lot of theoretical discussion about how intercultural citizenship might be incorporated into education, there is still little empirical research on this, particularly from students' own perspectives. And I think it's fair to say that it's not at all clear if international educational or intercultural communication experiences do actually lead to the expected development of intercultural citizenship. And further research is very much needed. Furthermore, from the point of view of applied linguists and language teachers, the linguistic dimensions of intercultural citizenship have often been completely ignored. They're either not mentioned, or where they are mentioned, they're typically marginalized and not given a very prominent role. And obviously, as linguists and language teachers, this is something we're interested in. This is combined with the increasing role of English in higher education. So I'm sure, as everyone's very familiar with, lots of internationalization in higher education has been through increases in English medium instruction or English medium education programs. So in the study that I'm going to talk about, we aim to gain a better understanding of Thai students' international experiences of learning and using English before, during, and after study abroad, and the relationship, if there was any, to intercultural citizenship. So specifically, the study aimed to explore the extent to which students felt that ELT had prepared them for the intercultural aspects of student mobility and their EME programs, what their perceptions of English learning and use in ELT and EME were, how these may or may not have related to the development of an identity as an intercultural citizen, and then finally what the implications of all of this may be for ELT, including areas such as EAP and ESP. Okay, so I think it would be helpful now to go through some of the key theories and terminology that I'm going to use throughout the rest of this talk. So I'm going to focus on 4 different areas. So the internationalization of higher education, specifically focused on English medium education, the idea of student mobility, intercultural and global citizenship, and then lastly, English language teaching and global Englishes. So as I said at the beginning of the talk, there's been a huge expansion of internationalization in higher education over the previous 2 decades. And this has been closely associated with English medium education. And this has resulted in an increasingly multilingual and multicultural landscape for internationally orientated universities. And this multilingualism and multiculturalism is really important. And this is a theme that will come up throughout the presentation. So the multilingual and multicultural nature of EME programs means that linguistic and cultural issues are often central for successful student experiences. And the intercultural dimension is frequently cited as one of the major features of internationalization. So if we take Knight's very well cited definition of internationalization, she defines it as the process of integrating an international, intercultural or global dimension into the purposes, functions or delivery of higher education at the institutional and national levels. So you can see from this definition that the intercultural and global dimensions are key to internationalization. And students in international higher education programs are often expected to develop their intercultural competence and to cultivate an identity as an intercultural citizen. Yeah, if you look at the aims of many universities, so particularly universities that claim to be international in one way or another, you'll almost always find the term global citizen or intercultural citizen somewhere in their aims or their kind of overall policy documents. Yeah, but what this actually means in practice, I think, is still far from clear. So how does this relate specifically to English? So as I've said, the internationalization of higher education has been closely associated with an expansion of EME programs. How best to define EME, though, is still a matter of debate. So I don't want to get into a lot of discussion about this, but certainly at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to go further into, if people are interested, to talk more about how we might define EME or EMI. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to follow Diffuse and Smith's English medium education in multilingual university settings, yeah, which its abbreviation is MMUS, which is a bit of a mouthful. So they have very helpfully shortened it to EME, so English medium education. The reason I've chosen this definition is because this definition emphasizes that English occurs in multilingual settings and refers to education, thus including both learning and teaching. Yep, so that multilingual dimension is forefronted, plus the educational dimension. An important point to note is that this means that EME includes international programs in Anglophone settings. Yeah, and I think this is a really important point to understand with EME and internationalization, that Anglophone settings are not separate or unique in some way from other international settings. Yeah, repeated research has shown that any kind of international program, whether it be in the UK, Thailand, Japan, or the United States, shares many of the same issues as regards multilingualism and interculturality as other international EME programs. Okay, so the next area that I want to talk about, which is closely linked to internationalization of higher education, is student mobility. So student mobility is an area of research that's much longer and much older than the internationalization of higher education. So this is something that people have been looking at, certainly within Europe, for 40 or 50 years now. And student mobility and study abroad is an area where many of the issues around internationalization and intercultural citizenship come to the fore, both during preparation for time abroad and the sojourn itself. As with internationalization of higher education, one of the claimed benefits of student mobility is the development of students' intercultural awareness and a sense of intercultural or global citizenship. However, as I said, research in this area is much more extensive and much longer in its history than internationalization. And what such research has shown is that study abroad experiences do not by themselves guarantee development in intercultural awareness and citizenship. Yeah, and it's crucial that students receive appropriate preparation, that they get appropriate support during their time abroad, and that they have space for evaluation and reflection of their experiences abroad. Yep, so what decades worth of student mobility research has shown is that certainly experiences in study abroad can lead to the development of intercultural awareness and intercultural citizenship, but they don't necessarily so. They can also have very negative experiences as well. And it's crucial that teachers support students in their intercultural development. So this brings us on to intercultural or global citizenship. So, as I said, I'm going to use the terms interchangeably here. Global citizenship is perhaps the more widely used term in general education. Intercultural citizenship is perhaps more closely associated with language teaching. Yeah, but certainly from the point of view of this study, the two terms can be used interchangeably. So intercultural citizenship can be described as the extension of citizenship beyond national borders and recognition of the global scale of social relations, the need to respect and value diversity and participation in and responsibility to communities at multiple levels from the global to the local. Yep, so it's really the idea of students becoming both local students, but also attached to other global communities. Yeah, so this idea of multiple levels or scales in the kind of communities and identities that students have. So for education, this leads to intercultural citizenship education, which aims to facilitate intercultural learning experiences and engagement with others, leading to change both in individuals' behaviours and self-perceptions, as well as in their behaviour and perceptions towards others. So probably the most well-known definition of intercultural citizenship education is that given by Michael Byram. So he defines intercultural citizenship education as firstly causing or facilitating intercultural citizenship experiences and analysis and reflection on this and on the possibility of further social and or political activity. By political, he doesn't mean political in the sense of political parties. He means activity that involves working with others to achieve an agreed end. So political activity here means engagement with communities. Secondly, intercultural citizenship education is defined as creating learning and change in the individual, cognitive, attitudinal and behavioural change in self-perception and change in relationship with others. Change that is based in the particular but is related to the universal. And as I said, this is a very well-used definition of intercultural citizenship, and it's the one, of intercultural citizenship education, and it's the one that we use to inform our research here. So how does this relate to English language teaching? So much preparation for student mobility and English medium education programs is conducted through English language teaching and in-sessional support through EAP and ESP courses. Yeah, so clearly ELT has a crucial role here. Indeed, the language classroom has been proposed as the ideal site for the development of intercultural citizenship. Intercultural citizenship education builds on previous intercultural education approaches such as intercultural communicative competence and awareness. And intercultural citizenship has been proposed as an alternative to the widely criticised use of native speakers as the model and goal in second language education, including in English language teaching. And I think it's also important when we talk about ELT to take a global Englishes perspective. So similar to the focus of intercultural communication and intercultural education, global Englishes perspectives on ELT typically focus on multilingualism and decentering of Anglophone settings and speakers. Yeah, and again, we'll talk about this in more detail. But just for those of you not familiar with global Englishes, although I'm guessing as Yusuf works there, you probably are all very familiar with it by now. But in case you're not, global Englishes is the linguistic and social cultural dimensions of global uses and users of English. So it's an umbrella term covering English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, and English as a world, and world Englishes. Now, I'm going to specifically focus on English as a lingua franca, and this can be defined as any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often only option. And also more recently, Jennifer Jenkins has emphasized the multilingual dimension to this. So she discusses English as a multilingual franca, multilingual communication in which English is available as a contact language of choice, but is not necessarily chosen. So I think the important thing to take away from this is that when we approach English within ELT, for international higher education and study abroad, we need to approach it from a global Englishes and English as a lingua franca perspective. So what are some of the current core issues with intercultural citizenship? So as I said at the beginning, it's still a topic which is fairly new and there's not that much empirical research into intercultural citizenship education. So some of the issues that have come up, which are still under investigation, are different perspectives on intercultural citizenship. So there are concerns that neoliberal perspectives, which emphasize the development of intercultural citizenship for the employment and economic benefits of global elites, have proved pervasive. Yep, so when I've talked about intercultural citizenship education, particularly approaches such as Michael Byram's, they're very much based on the idea of social justice and making relationships between many different kinds of communities. However, there are alternative perspectives on intercultural citizenship and global citizenship, which are more related to really economic and social benefits for global elites. By elites, I don't just mean the super wealthy, I mean people who already benefit from education, the kind of people who typically engage in international education, study abroad, etc. Yeah, and these are people who already do very well out of higher education. And the concern is that global citizenship is just yet another way to give them further empowerment and to separate them from other communities. So there's been a tension between approaches which focus on engaging with diverse communities and social justice and these neoliberal approaches, which it has been argued can result in increased stratification of social divides. So as I said, increasing the gaps between global elites and everyone else. Furthermore, how best to define intercultural citizenship can be different in different settings. So there are diverse interpretations in different national and educational contexts. Yep, so how global citizenship is defined for the United Nations might be very different to how it might be defined, for example, in Chinese education policy or British education policy. And as I said before, although intercultural citizenship has been extensively discussed in education theory, there's still a lack of empirical research demonstrating its relevance to actual classroom practices and students' own experiences of international higher education. And as shown in the study abroad research and also more recent intercultural citizenship research, there is debate concerning the extent to which experiences of internationalization and student mobility actually result in the hoped for development of intercultural citizenship. Secondly, from the point of view of applied linguists and ELT, how the linguistic issues, and especially the use of English, are related to intercultural citizenship is still far from clear. So there is very little research in this area. Now, given the key role of language in identity development, including the development of an intercultural citizenship identity, I would argue this needs to be given greater prominence. Furthermore, much of the preparation for student mobility assumes a correlation between the language of instruction in an institution, a local host community, and a national culture and language. Yeah, and I would argue that this is much too simplistic an approach to language. So where language has been dealt with in study abroad preparation, it's typically this kind of oversimplified approach. And this is problematic as the increasingly international orientation of higher education means that we can't take these connections for granted. So diverse student and staff bodies make higher education highly multilingual and multicultural. And this is especially true in Anglophone settings, yet where staff and students come from around the world, and actually there'll be very few native speakers present. Finally, the study I'm going to talk about today builds on earlier research that I did with my colleague from China, Fan Fang, who I believe has spoken at your university as well. So what we found in our previous research was a number of issues. Firstly, on a positive perspective, our research for Chinese study abroad students showed that their time in international universities abroad could lead to the development of intercultural citizenship. Yeah, and some students certainly developed this. However, it varied quite a lot among the students. And we also found that it didn't necessarily guarantee development. There could also be negative experiences during study abroad, which led to a rejection of intercultural citizenship. So some of our participants came back from their year or 6 months abroad less positive about intercultural interactions than others than before they went. Yeah, which is obviously an issue of a lot of concern if one of the main reasons for studying abroad is to develop intercultural skills. Another thing we found in our research was that there was a very strong link between learning and using English and intercultural citizenship, to the extent that for some students the two were seen as synonymous. So learning to use English was part of becoming an intercultural citizen for some of our students in these studies. And lastly, we found that most of the development of intercultural citizenship came from students' own experiences rather than any of their educational experiences. And that most of the students felt that their English language teaching preparation was inadequate for study abroad, and particularly for the intercultural and intercultural citizenship dimensions of this. So really what these studies showed was that there was still a lot more work to be done on intercultural citizenship and intercultural citizenship education, particularly within ELT. Okay, so those are the main kind of issues that I think provide the background for this study. So what I'm going to do now is go on to talk about the study itself. So the study was titled Thai Study Abroad Students as Intercultural Citizens, Developing Intercultural Citizenship Through English Medium Education and ELT. Yeah, and it was a project that was done in collaboration with 4 other researchers. So you'll certainly recognize the first person there. Yeah, so Dr. Yusuf Bunsek. Yeah, and here's a photo of him, I think, graduating from Southampton University. Okay, the second person I know is here, so it's very great to see Chitima. See a photo of her there. Oh, I think someone's got their microphone on. Okay, good. And we were also, another collaborator was Jaewon Ra, who at the time was at Mahidol University. She's now in Paris. And Navapon Snowden, who at the time was at Kasetsat University and is now at Newcastle University in the UK. So it's very much a collaborative project between myself and the 4 co-researchers here. Okay, so the setting of the study was obviously Thailand. I'll talk briefly about some of the issues in Thailand, but I suspect you're more familiar with these than I am. Yeah, and we can again discuss these in more detail at the end of the presentation. So annual figures show a continuous upward trend in Thai students' interest in studying abroad, particularly in Anglophone countries such as the UK, the USA and Australia. Furthermore, this has been accompanied by an increasing internationalization of Thai higher education itself over the previous decade. So really the kind of internationalization at home approach, where home programs become more international in their outlook. There's been a continued prominence given to English language education in the Thai education system at both school and higher education levels, and an increasing role of English in gatekeeping examinations, so entrance and exit exams from higher education in Thailand. And there's been there is a general perception of the importance of English as a vital communication tool between Thailand and the region, particularly as the official working language of ASEAN and also globally. However, as in many other settings internationally, there's still very much an orientation towards native English norms and Anglophone pedagogies. There is little evidence so far of Thai education embracing the multilingual and multicultural nature of English language use as a lingua franca globally, or international education being incorporated into policy or practice in any kind of deep way within Thai English language teaching. Yeah, but again, we can discuss this in more detail at the end if you disagree. And study abroad and internationalization of higher education remains under-researched in Thailand, especially as regards the role of English and intercultural citizenship. So how did we go about this study? So the methodology we employed was mixed methods. We collected data from students at 4 universities who had either experience of study abroad or were planning to study abroad in the near future. We used questionnaire data, so we had data from before and after study abroad with a total of 280 participants, and then we made use of semi-structured interviews. Again, we had students before study abroad, 15 participants, and students after study abroad, 17 participants. And we used qualitative content analysis, top-down and emergent coding, and quantitative descriptive statistics. As I said, we had 4 sites. So these were a regional government university, 2 metropolitan government universities, and 1 private university. So the reason we picked these 4 sites was we wanted to get a degree of variety. So we wanted both regional and metropolitan universities, and we also wanted government and private. However, we did focus on prestigious institutions. So all of these are very well resourced universities that typically take students with quite high grades and either with good educational backgrounds or from reasonably high socioeconomic statuses. The reason we picked prestigious and well-resourced universities was because it was most likely that students would either be thinking of going abroad or already had experience of study abroad from such institutions. Yeah, while it would be really interesting to look at global citizenship in different kinds of institutions that are not so prestigious or where the students don't come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, we felt that we would be unlikely to find many students who actually had experience of study abroad. Yeah, so an obvious limitation of the project is that it has to be accepted that all the institutions would be considered reasonably elite institutions. Okay, so the 3 research questions that we were investigating were, firstly, what are Thai study abroad students' experiences of English language teaching and use regarding preparation for study abroad, intercultural communication, and intercultural citizenship? The second question was, what are the relationships between perceptions and use of English, other languages, and intercultural communication and intercultural citizenship? And then lastly, in what ways do participants increase awareness or not of intercultural communication and intercultural citizenship as a result of study abroad? Okay, and what I'll do now is we'll go through each of those 3 questions and I'll talk about some of the things we found under each of the 3 questions. So beginning with the first question, just to remind you what that was, it's what are Thai study abroad students' experiences of English language teaching and use regarding their preparation for study abroad and the intercultural and dimensions to this. So firstly, looking at the questionnaire data, you can see the 2 graphs on the left relate to the students before study abroad, and the 2 graphs on the right relate to students post study abroad, so once they've come back from their experiences. Now, in terms of preparation, what's perhaps not so great is that in all of the studies, in all of the responses, the majority of responses are either neutral or negative. Yeah, so students either felt that their preparation was neutral or negative. However, there are still a reasonable number of positive responses. Yeah, it's just unfortunate that they're less than the negative responses. And perhaps some good news is that the students positive to neutral increases from once they've been abroad. But overall, I think what this shows is quite a mixed picture of how well students feel ELT has prepared them for study abroad. Yeah, with the majority of responses being within the kind of the neutral band, that there were benefits to their ELT, but there were also, as we'll see in the qualitative data, quite a lot of limitations and gaps in their preparation. Yeah, so this would suggest that as English language teachers, we still have things to consider and work to do. So some students felt that they hadn't been at all well prepared for study abroad. So there were lots of responses like the one I've got here. So in this one, the researcher asked, if their previous learning experiences help them study abroad, and the student laughs and says, no, not at all. Yeah, my field of study did not focus on intercultural communication, so I was not aware of it and didn't see any need to consider doing anything to improve it. Yeah, and we got quite a lot of responses like this when we asked students how well their English language teaching or general education experiences have prepared them for intercultural communication while abroad. They said not at all. However, this wasn't all students. Yep, some students were more positive. Yep, so for example, if you look at extract 2, the student says that in fact it helped quite significantly. Many courses were useful and knowledge can be practically applied in real life abroad. Yep, so some students were prepared. Yeah, a more common response though perhaps was this kind of mixed response. So I can use some but not all. I mean, what I learned in English classes was different from what I experienced in real life there, for example, greetings. Yeah, so some bits of it were helpful, some bits of it were not so helpful. Another important point that some of the students brought up was that the preparation did depend on the subject they were studying. So, for example, English majors they felt were much better prepared, yeah, because they'd done more courses on things like intercultural communication, whereas if your major was a different subject, then you had very minimal preparation. In terms of specifically focusing on the intercultural education dimensions, again, the responses didn't show a lot of preparation. So many students said none at all, but where they did talk about it, it was often a kind of ad hoc, not very well organized things, and typically quite stereotyped and broad. So if we look at extract 5, the student says we looked at cultural differences, manners, beliefs, taboos, broad study. Yeah, so very kind of general things that were not particularly helpful or relevant to their study abroad. But perhaps more positively, another student noted that once they actually arrived in their study abroad environment, then they were offered many courses. So she says, I had never heard these terms until I entered the program, and they were included in many courses. I would say these terms were always mentioned in many different courses. So although she didn't get any preparation for study abroad, once she was abroad, she felt that things like intercultural education or intercultural communication were well supported by the courses she had there. Okay, so going on to the second question, what are the relationships between perceptions and use of English, other languages, and intercultural communication and intercultural citizenship? So again, if we begin with the questionnaire data, we have 2 questions here. So what kind of English is most useful for you, and what kind of English do you like the most? We can see with the usefulness of English, there's kind of a 50-50 split between Anglophone Englishes or local uses of English. But when it comes to which English do students like the most, they still prefer Anglophone Englishes. Yep, so there's quite a big swing in favour of Anglophone Englishes with 62% versus 38% for local Englishes. And if we look at the qualitative data from the interviews, this is perhaps not surprising. So, for example, the students frequently mention that in classes they're taught American and British English. Yeah, we are taught American English for them rather than British English, and that's easy to understand. And the other student says, not just in classes, but outside, I always hear American English from different media in Thailand, especially movies, news, and song. Yeah, so it's not surprising that students orientate towards American or British English, yeah, and particularly American English, if that's what they experience in their education, and if that's what they see in the media outside. But of course, from a global English's perspective, this is very problematic because this is not the kind of English that they're going to hear or experience in their international education experiences. Okay, but something that we did find was that post-study abroad, students typically had a more positive perspective on their own English. So for example, in extract 9, we can see this student says, I think that my own English is not bad. It's understandable and cute. Also, when I was abroad, everybody spoke differently and no one was interested to see if anyone would talk like a native. We focused more on communication. Yeah, and this came up a lot. So this kind of pragmatic approach to English is not who you sound like, it's whether you're successful at communicating or not. Yeah, very quickly, whether someone sounded like a native or not was something nobody even thought about. And furthermore, from people who had experience of study abroad, again, this idea of being communicatively successful as being more important than the type of English was something that was mentioned a lot. Yeah, and specifically in relation to intercultural communication. So this student here talks about, although my English may not be perfect, I believe that if I know who I'm speaking with, everything will be easier. On the other hand, despite the excellent English, if one fails to understand other cultures, conversations could be misunderstood. Yeah, so the idea that it's much more important to have intercultural communication skills than it is to be have excellent English, as he terms it. Okay, in terms of how this relates to intercultural citizenship, as in the previous study, there was this idea that the two things, English language and intercultural citizenship, are linked. So this student here in Extract 11 explicitly states this. I think they go hand in hand. For me, English was the first bridge to the international world. Yeah, so this idea that to develop a sense of intercultural citizenship, that you need to develop your English language skills. Yeah, and again, if we look at extract 12, this student begins by saying something similar. I would say it's the most important thing to become an intercultural citizen, since like English is the main language of the world. But they do go on to add a however to this. So they recognize also that it's not just English. So they do say it would also be great if we can speak their language, such as Chinese and stuff like that. It's going to help us, like if you have a lot of nations, if you know those two basic languages and then they add Spanish to it as well. So they're still talking about large global languages, but there is a recognition here that Chinese and Spanish, or just the idea of knowing other languages, not just English, is important for being a global citizen. However, not everybody was positive about the kind of multilingual dimensions to intercultural citizenship. Yeah, now this was a minority of responses, but nevertheless, it was a response that came up a few times. So for example, this student explicitly says, I think I'm just like every other people who no doubt, but don't want to be in an environment that is bilingual. Yeah, and then he talks about his experiences of India. Yeah, and then when he was growing up in Malaysia, and that people didn't, as he terms it, speak proper English. If I go to a purer English-speaking community, I would be able to learn English better. Yeah, so as I said, while this was the minority of responses, there were some responses like this. So the idea that a multilingual environment where English is used as a lingua franca was problematic somehow because it wasn't a pure English. Yeah, and this is something that we'll come back to when discussing students' experiences of the multicultural and multilingual dimension of international higher education. Okay, so now we come to the final question. In what ways do participants increase awareness of intercultural communication and intercultural citizenship as a result of their study abroad? Okay, so looking at the questionnaire data, the students were asked, do you consider yourself an intercultural or global citizen? So looking at both the pre and post study abroad overall, we can see that, so this part here, the 8, 27 and the 41 are broadly that the students consider themselves at some time, yeah, or perhaps often and sometimes even always, an intercultural citizen. So the majority of students at some point identify with global citizenship. So it's actually a kind of a reasonably positive concept even before study abroad. However, we did find that post-study abroad, it rose further. So over 85% of students identified with intercultural or global citizenship after their study abroad experiences. However, the qualitative data, the interview data, gave a bit more of a mixed picture. So although this looks very positive, once we got to the interview data, it wasn't quite so positive. So what we typically found was that for students who were pre-study abroad, that although they were positive about the idea of intercultural global citizenship, they actually weren't able to talk about it in any depth and weren't very clear about what it means. So, for example, this student here says this very clearly. Oh, okay, let me be blunt. I'm not sure what they mean. Yeah, and this was a response that came up frequently. They thought it sounded like a nice idea, but they didn't really know what it meant. Where they did try and define it, it was often in quite simplistic terms, yeah, and quite stereotype terms. So different people from different countries, different backgrounds or cultures. Yeah, no, there's nothing really wrong with this, but it is perhaps a bit more of a simplistic understanding of global citizenship. And as we'll see, the post-study abroad students typically had a much more sophisticated and in-depth understanding of what global citizenship might mean. So, for example, post-study abroad students often talked about the developmental nature of global citizenship. So for this student here, I'm not sure if it's a he or she, but they are reflecting on their experiences of study abroad and how that led to the development of becoming an intercultural citizen. So they say that when they first arrived, back then I would confidently say no. Yeah, when they first arrived in their study abroad environment, they weren't a global citizen. Yeah, but now, the researcher asked them, now I think I am one of them. And then they go on to describe all the different factors that occurred that led to them feeling that they developed a sense of global citizenship. Yeah, so if we look at the final extract, I like to go out and do things with my international friends. Yeah, we got to share experiences with them and my perceptions of the world expanded. I had a chance to learn about many things I did not know before. Yep, so emphasizing this idea of perhaps not beginning as a global citizen, but developing as a global citizen through their experiences of relating to other people in international environments abroad. And students again brought up other aspects that are crucial to intercultural citizenship. So this idea of being open-minded, yeah, of expanding your perceptions of things came up frequently as well. So in extract 17, the student says, I think I'm more open-minded. Yeah, and then they go on to say, I used to be quite conservative and quite nationalist, but now I'm not like that anymore and my mind has opened. Yeah, so lots of students talked about opening their mind or expanding their mind or ideas in one way or another. And also going beyond the nation. So in extract 18, the student talks about going beyond the national scale very specifically. So he says, my understanding is that I think nationalities and languages are just a shell of who we are. It's hitting me more right now when I meet with the Korean parents, so his partner is Korean and he meets her family. Yeah, it's about learning and adjusting. So this idea of going beyond nationalities and perhaps stereotyped views of other cultures and going beyond national languages, and again returning to this idea of learning and adjusting and developing. Yeah, and these are all crucial aspects of developing a global citizenship or intercultural citizenship identity. Yeah, of constantly developing and adjusting yourself and going beyond stereotypes. Okay, and we also asked the students to what extent they thought their education contributed to their development of intercultural citizenship. So for a few students, they were very positive about this. So for example, this student says, the course itself literally focused on this. There were many courses which were not directly related to only linguistics. Yeah, there were, even if the name of the program was this idea that actually lots of the courses they had while studying abroad in one way or another informed them and helped them understand intercultural citizenship education. However, I would say that this was not especially common. Yeah, we had some students who reported this, but much more common was what this student in extract 20 reports. So this is making their own efforts. So they say, I learned both English and intercultural communications from real situations. I know classrooms are real situations, but I think the student here means real situations outside the classroom. So I felt I actually learned these not just because I stayed there, but I watched Netflix or YouTube. Yeah, so the fact that for them, they found an effective way of learning about English and intercultural communication was to look at, to go online, yeah, and look at streaming services like Netflix. Yeah, so this was just one approach. There were many different approaches, but the factor that came up a lot in students' responses to intercultural citizenship education was that lots of it came from their own experiences rather than formal courses at university or before study abroad. Where intercultural communication or intercultural citizenship courses were actually offered by the institutions, the responses were also quite mixed from students. So, for example, in extract 21, this student talks about the course was important, but they felt that they didn't need it. Yeah, so they suggest that For international students who've been there in their first year of study abroad, it will be very helpful. But this student had multiple years of study abroad experience. Yeah, and they felt that the courses were perhaps too basic for them. For other students, the pressures of their degree subjects meant that even though they would have liked to have attended intercultural communication courses, yeah, they just didn't have time. So even though I wished to join them all, it was not practical. I could not even catch up with the regular classes. And then finally, this student here comments on some of the courses being very basic and stereotyped. Yeah, so maybe for the orientation day, the university advised us about the culture, the British culture, because we are like a different country. We should abroad, what we should do if what happened there, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and I think I particularly like this response because I think the student is correctly identifying that often the courses offered by universities are very stereotyped, yeah, and not particularly helpful. Yeah, and the student has recognized that this course is a bit blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's not actually going to be very helpful for their experiences during intercultural communication. Okay, in terms of the kinds of experiences that they had that led to them developing a sense of intercultural citizenship identity, many students mentioned the international nature of the programs they were on. Yeah, as I said earlier, lots of their development came from their own experiences, and their own experiences were based on interacting with other international students. So in extract 24, the student says, there are many international students here from many countries. I get to practice the language and learn about their cultures. Yeah, so the idea that they developed intercultural citizenship because they were interacting with people from many different countries. And this is in contrast to the idea of going to, for example, the UK and then interacting with British people. Yeah, and in extract 25, the student explicitly refers to this. Yeah, I don't think I would be too comfortable being around the locals or English native speakers too much because most of them cultural background is different. Yep, so all of their or most of their experiences of international education were with other international students. So native speakers weren't really part of their experiences, and this meant that they actually thought they'd feel uncomfortable if a native speaker was present. However, not all the students felt this way. Some students were much more negative about these international dimensions to international higher education. So, for example, in extract 26, the student says, I expect I'm going to see the English people, but when I'm there, most of them, they are surprised me that they were Asian, as well as there are Chinese and Indian. So I'm a bit shocked. Yeah, so they weren't expecting the international nature of their program. Similarly, in extract 27, they say, to be honest, everything was desirable about studying there except for one thing. There were too many students from Asia, especially from China. Chinese students accounted for over 60% of the classroom. And then lastly, yeah, he goes on to say, I did not get to use English with native speakers enough. The place is filled with Asian students. Yeah, these students from some countries use the kinds of English that are incomprehensible. Okay, so this is a very negative impression of other international students. Now, this I think is really problematic because most international programs in Anglophone settings are very international. Yeah, native English speakers are the minority and they have been for decades now. So this would suggest that these students were very badly prepared for their experiences of intercultural communication. Yeah, and it's unfortunate that, for example, this student in extract 27 took such a negative perspective on it. Yeah, the other students' English was incomprehensible. Yeah, rather than recognizing it for being the international multilingual environment that it was. Okay, so going on to discuss what are some of the core issues that come out from these findings. So firstly, I guess a good point is that most of the participants expressed favourable attitudes towards intercultural citizenship and felt that it was an identity they would like to develop or had already developed. But understanding of intercultural citizenship was quite mixed, as we saw from the interview extracts, and for pre-study abroad students, it was often fairly superficial. Post-study abroad students, though, were able to discuss intercultural citizenship in much more depth in relation to experiences of other cultures and countries, and the ability to use languages, typically English, but also other languages, for intercultural communication in a globally interconnected world. So there was a key role for language in the students' responses. So overall, I think we can say the concept of intercultural citizenship is a valid one in capturing parts of students' experiences and motivations for study abroad. In terms of ELT and preparation for study abroad, so a positive response from this project, at least, was that actually students here felt that the general ELT preparation for study abroad was okay. However, there were more mixed responses to the intercultural dimensions to that. So some students had received no intercultural education experience before, others ad hoc and superficial, or rather broad and essentialist courses. And few students discussed explicit preparation for intercultural citizenship. Yep, so although intercultural education was mentioned by quite a lot of the students, very few of them had had any courses about intercultural citizenship. Now, I think this is a concern for English language teaching because the intercultural dimensions are clearly still in the Thai context not well integrated into ELT, despite the fact there are now decades worth of research showing the importance of intercultural communicative competence and awareness in language teaching and study abroad. Yeah, and we'll come back to that a bit later when we talk about the implications for ELT. I think it's fair to say intercultural citizenship education is a much newer idea, so you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it in English language preparation, but it is important, and I think it's something that needs recognising in ELT. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's now an established part of general education to the extent that it's part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's been discussed in international education for a little while now, and it is beginning to make or to have quite important applications and implications for language teaching too. In terms of English and multilingualism, as I said, a key finding that came from this study and previous studies is that English is seen as a crucial part of developing an intercultural citizenship identity and providing opportunities for intercultural interaction. And students themselves generally seem to recognise that successful communication involves intercultural communication skills that go beyond the idea of native-like language use. The study did show some limited appreciation of multilingualism in developing intercultural citizenship, but it was limited and not all students were so positive about multilingualism. Furthermore, I think we can see that English was still viewed from a more normative native English speaker perspective, in which Anglophone English was seen as the most prestigious and participants' own use of English were less prestigious. So if you remember the questionnaire data, although the students felt that their own English was as useful as Anglophone English, they still liked American or British English more, yeah, which is problematic given that they're very unlikely to need or use it. However, there was some evidence, particularly with the post-study abroad experiences, that they began to value their own English more and realise the irrelevance often of native speaker types English. So overall, there were varied responses to English and the tensions between the kind of more normative monolingual educational and societal ideologies versus diverse multilingual and intercultural reality of higher education environments. Yeah, and this kind of tension is well documented in global Englishes research and English medium education research. Yeah, so this idea there's a tension between multilingual reality and kind of monolingual norms of teaching. In terms of the development of intercultural citizenship, as I said, there were generally positive perceptions of, and it seemed to be that participants post-study abroad did develop a sense of intercultural citizenship. However, pre-study abroad students typically discussed it in more culturally essentialist ways, fixed on national scales, yeah, which would suggest that their education hadn't prepared them very well for it. Yeah, in contrast, post-study abroad students were able to discuss it in more depth related to personal experiences and to talk about developmental aspects. Yeah, these are all crucial parts of intercultural citizenship. However, they do seem to come more from experiences rather than education. So overall, some, although not all students, seem to get support for intercultural communication during their study abroad, and this was generally rated positively. But as we saw, not all students were able to take up these courses. Yeah, either they felt they didn't have time or the courses were too general. It seems that intercultural education is better recognised in the actual international programs than it was in ELT. Yeah, so lots of the students talked about the fact that they didn't get much intercultural communication before studying abroad, but it was something that was often part of their courses once they were in their international university. Yeah, so it suggests that there's still more progress to be made with ELT. I think perhaps most concerning was, though, that some students while some students were well prepared for the intercultural and multilingual nature of English medium education programs, particularly in Anglophone settings, many others were surprised and reacted negatively. Yeah, now this is really problematic because Anglophone institutions and many international higher education programs have been highly multilingual and multicultural for decades now. And if students are still being prepared for Anglophone institutions as if they're going to go there and they're going to be surrounded by British speakers of English or Australian speakers of English, then they're being seriously underprepared and misrepresented in how they're prepared for going abroad. Yep. So I think this is something that really ELT and general preparation for international higher education programs needs to address. Yeah, no student should be going to an Anglophone setting expecting anything other than a very international setting. Perhaps the most positive thing to come out of this study was that, unlike previous research in intercultural citizenship and also more general study abroad research, there were no reports of a rejection of intercultural citizenship as a result of negative study abroad experiences. Yep, so none of the students we interviewed said that as a result of their study abroad experiences, they now didn't want to be intercultural citizens or they didn't like intercultural communication. Yeah, and this is different from earlier research that I've done, and it's also different from the findings in general study abroad research. Now, unfortunately, our data doesn't tell us exactly why that might be, but one possibility is that all the participants, when they were interviewed, were back in their home environments. So when they were interviewed, they were back in Thailand and they'd already completed their study abroad experiences. So it may be that they'd had time to reflect on and process their experiences and that they then saw them in a more positive way. And this is because space for reflection is a key part of intercultural development. So often when you talk to people directly after an intercultural experience, particularly if it's a difficult one, they may talk about it in negative terms, but given time to reflect on it and to kind of integrate it into their experiences in a more long-term way, then they may well come back to see it more positively. But unfortunately, we don't have the data to know if that's the case or not. So that's speculation, but I think there will be an interesting follow-up study to do there to see if people are more positive about their experiences once they've had time to reflect on them, yeah, maybe a year or 2 years after their study abroad experiences, than when they're actually in the middle of them and finding them quite difficult. Okay, so the final part of the presentation. What are the implications of all of this for English language teaching? So first of all, more support needs to be given to students to prepare them for the diverse multilingual and multicultural environments of international higher education. Yeah, and I think that came across very strongly from the data. Yeah, students were not well prepared for these intercultural and multilingual interactions. Given the extensive role of English in international higher education and the role ELT already plays in preparation for international study, the ELT classroom is the ideal place, I would argue, for the kind of support students need for intercultural communication in higher education. So what does this mean? So firstly, I think it means incorporating the intercultural dimension more systematically and deeply into ELT. Yeah, including intercultural citizenship. So this doesn't necessarily mean a radical change in teaching practices, since ELT is already well placed to provide intercultural education. Yet the focus of ELT is typically on communication with others across cultures. Yep, so the focus of ELT is already on in an intercultural dimension. So I don't think it creates a big change in the aims of ELT to do this. However, what is crucial is that ELT moves away from native speaker Anglophone orientations. Yeah, intercultural communication, whether it's in higher education or in many other settings, is going to be multicultural and multilingual, and this needs to be recognised in the aims of ELT. So intercultural language education approaches are already well established. This is not a new area. People have been doing research into this into the last 20 or 30 years. And it involves inclusion of the cultural dimensions to language use and learning, a focus on processes of intercultural and transcultural communication, and the development of ideas such as intercultural awareness and intercultural communicative competence. Yeah, and these often replace things like communicative competence, and the intercultural citizen replaces the native speaker. In terms of intercultural citizenship education itself, as I said, this is a bit more of a newer idea, but it is beginning to be researched quite extensively in a range of places. And this suggests a variety of ways in which intercultural education, citizenship, and ELT can be merged in teaching practice. So one well-established approach is through online teletandem intercultural exchanges. Yeah, I'm sure you're all familiar with virtual exchanges where English language learners in different parts of the world are matched up with each other, yeah, and interact together on online platforms of one kind or another. You can also incorporate things like intercultural group work into classes. These can include mini ethnographies, exploring linguistic and cultural complexity, both in other foreign communities or international communities, but also in local communities. Yet most local communities contain cultural and linguistic complexity when they're explored in depth. An important aspect of incorporating an intercultural citizenship dimension into language education is it needs to go beyond just raising awareness of intercultural issues. And it needs to actually engage learners in direct action with others and other communities. Yep, through things such as teletandem exchanges or intercultural group work. And furthermore, learners and teachers, I would argue as well, need to be given time and space to reflect on intercultural experiences in the classroom. Yep, so these need to be incorporated into parts of classroom teaching. Okay, so what does this mean for multilingual approaches to English? So given the links between English, higher education and EME and intercultural citizenship, there needs to be greater awareness of the varied uses and users of English in ELT. So we need alternatives to the dominant Anglophone native speaker, and I would say colonial ideologies that still underpin much ELT. So this means more recognition of local uses of English and valuing those, awareness of the variable fluid uses of English for intercultural and transcultural communication, and understanding of the multilingual environments in which English occurs, including Anglophone EME environments and translanguaging. So one approach that I think is well suited for this is Global Englishes. So the perspectives on ELT are outlined in Global Englishes and ELF pedagogic research are highly salient to this approach. So this includes a critical approach to language that challenges native speakerism and monolingual standard language norms, the use of English as an academic lingua franca where variability and adaptability are crucial or seen as crucial for successful communication. Translanguaging recognised as a common phenomena with potential beneficial pedagogic practices that open up spaces for learners to use all of their linguistic resources. Yep, so the idea of incorporating translanguaging into the classroom. And this has significant implications as well for how we go about examining and assessing students. So at the moment, the increase in exams such as IELTS or TOEFL, which are based on monolingual native speaker orientations, I think are increasingly problematic given the intercultural and multilingual nature of many higher education institutions. So if we draw these different pedagogic perspectives together, we get approaches such as post-normative approaches, ELF awareness, and English as a multilingual franca awareness, and transcultural ELT. Yeah, and again, we can talk about these ideas in a bit more detail at the end if people are interested. But overall, learners need to be given space to consider the links between languages, learning, use, intercultural connections, and their identification with intercultural citizenship, as well as a move away from potentially disempowering colonial native speaker orientations. Also, I think for teachers, by integrating intercultural citizenship and critical aware approaches to language and their practices, we need to make it part of teacher education. Yeah, so teachers won't have time to do this kind of thing by themselves. They need support, yeah, and that support typically comes from both pre-service and in-service teacher education. But I would argue that global Englishes and intercultural citizenship approaches provide teachers with an opportunity to reflect on their own use of English and the development of an intercultural identity, and that this offers a more empowering alternative to the much criticised model of the native speaker of English as the ideal teacher. Okay, and finally, turning specifically to Thailand and some of the issues in Thailand, how is this relevant for ELT in Thailand? So clearly, lots of the general issues, I think at least, are relevant to Thailand, but there are some specific things that I think are particularly important. So language education policy in Thailand has already shifted from the idea of English as a foreign language to the idea of English as a lingua franca for communication in ASEAN. Yep, so lots of policy documents in Thailand over the last 10 to 15 years have very much focused on the importance of English as a medium of communication in the region and particularly ASEAN. Yep, so very much moving it away from Anglophone orientations. However, I think it would also be true to say that this has not been matched by an increase in an understanding of English as a multilingua franca, intercultural communication or intercultural citizenship. Yet these are not aspects that have been incorporated into policy. So despite the kind of overall change in focus to ASEAN, Thai ELT is still tied to inner circle Anglophone cultures and English varieties. And I would argue that such perspectives fail to address the needs of Thai students who are much more likely to use English for intercultural communication with other ELF users rather than with Anglophone native speakers. So, for example, Ra et al. Write that we need a reconceptualization of the current ELT curriculum and language policy in Thailand to equip learners with the ability to use English in multilingual intercultural contexts. ELT courses in Thailand should no longer exclusively adhere to standard language ideologies, and more emphasis should be put on strengthening learners' intercultural competence and awareness. However, there are obviously limitations to what can be done, and these should be recognised. So intercultural citizenship is, as I've repeatedly stressed, still quite a new concept and very much a concept that's under investigation, and how best to adapt it to different settings, including Thailand, is still a matter of debate. Yep, so we do need much more thought and research on how relevant intercultural citizenship will be in Thai settings. Thailand's traditional ELT policies and curriculums with these Anglophone orientations may not yet be ready and flexible enough to incorporate these perspectives. And linked to this, the kind of centralized power that policy documents have and centralized power that that the Ministry of Education, etc., have over teachers limits the amount that teachers can design and implement their own kind of materials, policies, and curriculums. Yep, so even if teachers are interested in intercultural citizenship and intercultural education, it may be difficult for them to integrate it into their teaching practices, due to centralized policies. However, I do think within higher education in particular, teachers typically have a lot more freedom And I think this would be the ideal setting and level in which to focus more on intercultural citizenship and intercultural education. Yeah, again, these are issues we can discuss in more detail at the end of the presentation. I'm sure you've got lots of ideas about this and you probably know more about this than I do. So the final slides, in conclusion. So the positive aspects of the study showed positive attitudes towards intercultural citizenship from the students and positive attitudes towards intercultural citizenship education. Students generally felt that ELT had actually prepared them quite well for different aspects of study abroad. And study abroad itself did seem to lead to more in-depth development of intercultural citizenship. I've got the last one under positive, but I'm not sure really if it's a positive or negative. It's just a feature. But a feature of the study was that, again, it showed that there were strong links in the perception of students between the development of English and the development of intercultural citizenship. However, some of the negative things that the study brought up were that intercultural education and intercultural citizenship were not well integrated into ELT. Yep, so most students' development came from their own personal experiences and their own efforts during their study abroad time. And there were still tensions between an idealized Anglophone monolingual native speaker norms and the reality of multilingual, intercultural and international higher education programs and the use of English as a lingua franca, not as a monolingual native language. So I think there is a central role for ELT in English medium instruction through intercultural language education and raising awareness of diverse multilingual uses of English as a lingua franca in higher education. Yeah, so just to stress that last point, I think ELT is central in better preparing learners for their experiences of international education, and those experiences will inevitably be intercultural and hopefully lead to the development of intercultural citizenship. Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are my references, which I'm happy to send anyone if they're interested. So, Kopken Krab, we've finished now. So if there are any questions, comments, or things people would like to discuss, I'd be very happy to do that now.
Yes, so thank you very much. Such a thought-provoking ideas and presentation ever, right? Because both of us, I mean, me and my co-moderator, Suchada, we have been in this ELT, which was as a newly appointed teachers, and we have been experiencing this kind of problem, if I may say so, because even though we try to build and try to create the environment, especially English language teaching by using English, not focuses more on the grammar or the rules or any structure of that, still the curriculum design that was provided by those supervision and those who are directly responsible toward this is designed in which we need to focus more on those structures. So from my deep and what to the things that has embedded in my mind, I think that in order to change this, not 100% change, but I mean, in order to raise awareness about intercultural citizenship and intercultural education, I think this kind of action need to be taken into account as we are right here as an English teacher. Yes, that is what I think from what I have learned from your talk. So thank you.
Yes, on top of that, it can be clearly seen that English language plays an enormous role on socio-cultural perspective and inevitably intertwined with language learning and teaching dimension. English is now developed into Englishes according to its variety used globally. So in the classroom setting, it significantly raised a question for the teachers. On which dimension should we bring to the classroom? The language ownership or the use of the language? And thank you, Associate Professor Will Becker, for your remarkable presentation. And now is the time for your question. If any one of you have the question to ask Professor Will, you are free to ask now. I'm sure that you may now still thinking. When you are ready, you can unmute yourself and then ask the question.
Actually, there is a
Yeah.
question on the chat box, I guess.
I think we've got a hand up as well, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
Great.
fine.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Baker. And actually, I have made a comment and I posted the question in the chat box. So basically, I think that the problem is that we often adopt the perspective that we should teach English for communicative purposes. And in my opinion, many teachers remain stuck in that vacuum, that they have to go to the classroom, that they have to meet their objectives, that by the end of the course, students should learn particular linguistic objectives. And I think that this is actually quite restrictive. And at the end, we don't end up teaching students intercultural competence. And I think that there should be more interaction between teachers from different nationalities. And there should be more steps aimed at basically investigating their epistemological beliefs, their beliefs about knowledge, about language teaching, about language learning. Because to be honest, I don't really often hear teachers talking about that particular role in the classroom. They basically inherit that philosophy which is imposed to them on the management, that they have to finish that course within that particular period of time. And it kind of overshadows the idea of promoting global citizens. And actually, I think there will be a very interesting research study investigating teachers' epistemological beliefs about their belief systems before and after the course, about how they interact with students, what they find out about students and their cultures. And I think to a great extent, teachers know so little about their students, their culture, or they often don't talk about it. So I believe that there should be ethnographic studies where teachers revise their epistemological beliefs. They do research about the students' culture, and they investigate how they do further studies related to identity, whether students adopt new identities through language learning and basically engaging with the English language. And I think that sometimes we pass a very negative example onto our students.
Okay, yes, no, I mean, I agree with everything you've said there. I think the place to do that would be teacher education, though. Obviously, teachers are very pressured. They, like you described, they often just want to get through the course, to cover the materials and things, and they're under pressure to do that. So I think it's crucial that teacher education, both pre-service and in-service, gives teachers the opportunity to, as you say, examine their epistemological beliefs and to think about, I mean, hopefully most of our language teaching is focused on the idea of communication and interacting with others, however we might define others, but for teachers to be given space to think, okay, so what does that mean? Because I think concepts of communicative successfulness in language teaching and ELT are very problematic, because they're typically very restricted idea of what successful communication is, and based on I think an inappropriate model of a monolingual communicator in a language. But teachers, again, as I said, they need space and time to be able to think about these things. So hopefully it's an issue that can be addressed in pre-service courses, in-service courses. And I know it is something that certainly teachers who go on to do masters, etc., will come across. I think there are very few masters programs now in ELT or applied linguistics that wouldn't have a module that related to intercultural communication in some way, or kind of more inclusive approaches to communicative competence. So yes, I agree with you, and I think the giving teachers space to examine those beliefs is core, and hopefully it's something we can do through teacher education.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Will, for the presentation. I'm really interested in the portion of your presentation where you talked about ELT in Thailand. In one of your slides, you actually highlighted that Thailand has actually shifted its perception of English as a foreign language to language of ASEAN. I wonder what changes have occurred because of this paradigm shift, and what are we supposed to expect, okay, according to the shift? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so the changes that we've identified in the research I've done with colleagues is looking at policy documents and how they refer to the purposes and use of English when it's mentioned. Although quite often they just discuss the concept of foreign languages, but it is very much kind of, as I said, centered on ASEAN. But I think there's a disconnect there, because it's the idea that English is to be used for ASEAN, but then still the way that exams are written, the way that materials are written is very much Anglophone centered, and the idea of a monolingual use of English. So I know about 10 years ago now, there was a proposal for making changes in policy documents that would have incorporated multilingualism to a much greater extent, but they never went through. They just remained as a draft policy. So it's still, as I said, there's this gap between the idea that, okay, English is used regionally, it's more important as a regional language than it is as a language to communicate with American or British people, etc. But that doesn't, the follow-up step to that, which, okay, so if we recognize that, then it's English as a lingua franca in multilingual environments, doesn't seem to have occurred. So there is very much a gap. So how that gap is addressed, I think, is best decided by people who are based in Thailand, who are the people who are making the curriculum documents, who are writing the materials, who are teaching it. Yeah, I think, the research I've done with colleagues in Thailand has shown that the policy documents would allow it, but it would seem that in practice, it's much harder to actually implement it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And now we have another question from Mai.
Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you, Professor Will, for your insightful talk. And also hi to Sue. I don't know if Sue remembers me. We worked together before in the Wisely.
Oh, Mai. Hi, Mai. I still remember you.
Nice to see you again. Yes, so my question for Professor Will is about, concerning about my research. So I'm working on like a mini ethnographic study on an ELT teacher. So she's a native speaker, so English is her L1, but she's teaching World Englishes, and it's about her beliefs and her practices regarding the use of communication strategies in the Thai EFL classroom. And the findings of my research are that she tends to lean away from native speakerism, and she's very much into interculturality of English and pragmatism. So I'm wondering if using the terms intercultural, like citizen or international teacher, would be the right way to describe her in terms of the research keywording. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for your question. I guess, how does your research participant, the teacher, how does she see herself? How does she describe herself? Have you asked her? And
how did she describe herself? She didn't describe herself in a specific way. Like, she didn't say that I don't want to be called a native English speaker or native English teacher, but she said that she thinks English is intercultural. That's how that's the extract from her interviews. And so
okay, I think
and
I lost
actually for context, she teaches World Englishes as well, apart from other courses. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I was saying a while ago that she didn't actually phrase herself as a teacher verbatim. So maybe. Yes, hello.
Okay, yeah, I think I got the gist of it right. Okay, yeah, so she doesn't describe herself as a native speaker teacher. She describes herself in other ways. Yeah, and I think
Yes.
that's the important thing, is for teachers to take on that identity for themselves. And there is lots of literature on alternative aims and models in ELT. And of course, yeah, I mean, learning English as a second language or an additional language is always a multilingual process. And if people want to use it for communication, it will be an intercultural process as well. So the models need to reflect that. And yes, and I think it's interesting that you're doing your research with a native speaker. And of course, I'm at times I do identify as a native speaker of British English, but that's not a kind of influence on my teaching, or not a conscious influence on my teaching. So if I teach English obviously as a global language for intercultural or transcultural communication. And the fact I'm a native speaker is, I mean, it's not irrelevant. There are clearly all sorts of ideological issues around that, but I would certainly not hold up my own English as a model for people to copy. And I'm sure as you struggle to hear or understand some of my pronunciation through some of those slides, you'll recognize that native speakers are certainly not the easiest people to understand using English as a lingua franca. And I mean, that's something I emphasize a lot with my students, is that native speakers are often the hardest people to understand in international environments, because they frequently use English in ways that are inappropriate to an international and intercultural environment. But yeah, I mean, if your teacher recognizes this, that sounds great. And there is hope that I think younger teachers are much more aware that English is a global language and not the language just of the Anglophone world, and that's what should be influencing our teaching. But yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of your research when you finished it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mai, for your question, and thank you, Professor Will, for your clear answer. Is there any question from other participants? As far as I have seen in the chat box, there is no more question. So I wonder if anyone would love to ask.
Sushada, there is a question in the chat box, I guess.
Yes, from Success. So, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just read this question. The first one, what are the characteristics of one who refers themselves or is referred to as intercultural citizens? And can the characteristics be used to define students in both Anglophone and non-Anglophone countries? Yes.
Okay, shall I address that question first then? So, yeah, so I think as I showed on some of the slides, there are various different characteristics of intercultural citizens, or characteristics that intercultural citizenship education tries to develop. Excuse me. Typically, the main characteristics would be this idea of identifying with communities at many different levels and engaging with communities at different levels or scales. So the idea that you're connected both to local communities and your national community, but that you're also connected to global communities. So it's not just your own local or national community, that you have a sense of responsibility and identification with different global communities. And in order to do that is these ideas of being open-minded, by having a kind of relativistic approach to values, to being able to connect with people from different, who may have different sets of beliefs to yourself. And then engaging in action in some way. Now that action can be very simple. It can literally just be, communicating with people who are in one way or another you see as different, but also doing projects together. Often, I mean, what students talk about in international environments is their free time activities that they do together. You know, they go to, I don't know, a badminton club that's very international, but they're all part of the same badminton team or something like that. So there are lots of ways. I mean, and then there are also perhaps more serious ways about engaging in international organizations, engaging in work for social justice or environmental concerns and things like that. So there's a whole range of different things that are part of intercultural citizenship. And as I said, I mean, it's quite a new concept, and what exactly it might mean for education is very much still up for discussion and debate. And I think how it relates to different settings, so what might be relevant in a Thai secondary school classroom is probably very different to what would be relevant in an Anglophone international university. So I think whilst there are general characteristics we can talk about, the actual specifics, again, are something that I think local teachers and students and administrators, etc., need to decide. But it's hopefully a concept that I think is relevant in all settings in one way or another. And yes, I mean, it's both Anglophone and non-Anglophone. It has intercultural citizenship is not related to any particular setting. It is a general concept relevant to any setting where people are interacting across communities. So I'm just reading the second question. Why is it significant that local and international students develop intercultural citizenship, especially the ones who enrolled in international programs? Yeah, I mean, that is a very good question. Why should people be interested in intercultural citizenship? Well, I have two answers to that. The first one is that perhaps the more practical answer is that international universities very often, as I said at the beginning, make very explicit claims that if you come study with them, you will come out of your degree program or your master's program as an intercultural citizen. Yeah, for example, my own university has it written in on their policy statement and aims that if you come to study at Southampton University, you will emerge as a global citizen. Now, I think if universities are promising students that, they need to follow through and actually deliver that. And at the moment, it is unfortunately often just a marketing term. Now, I know Southampton has become more concerned with it over the last few years and is trying to integrate in various ways and to various degrees of success elements. But as to how seriously they take it, I think is still very much up for discussion. But if universities are going to offer it, and they do, then I think they need to, they need to take that seriously. If you're telling students they'll emerge from their programs as global citizens, you need to be very specific about how you're providing an educational environment that will result in that. So that's one reason. If you're promising something, you should deliver it. The second reason is I think generally it is a very good aim for students in any kind of educational program. I mean, if we read the more general educational literature, it suggests that one of the things that education can really do is develop these kind of identities where people are able to interact with communities at many different levels. And that should be one of the key goals of education, given that our worlds are now globally connected and not just at national scales, but on many different levels or scales. This is something that all students need to be prepared for, and all students need to recognize the way that their actions are interconnected with many other communities across the globe. So I think it's a very worthy aim in itself. And for language teaching, it is particularly relevant. I mean, language teaching, usually the main aim of language teaching is to enable students to communicate through that language that they're learning. And that communication will inevitably be multilingual and intercultural. And if it's multilingual and intercultural, then I think intercultural citizenship is the kind of aim or the kind of identity we should be fostering for our students and the kinds of aims that we should be presenting them with. That if you're communicating through another language, the model is not this kind of, this both unhelpful and unobtainable idealized native speaker, rather is this idea of an intercultural citizen. So hopefully that answers your questions as to why we should care about intercultural citizenship, but it is a very good question. I mean, it's not always obvious to people why this is a concept which they should be interested in. So I hope that answers your question. Seth, is it?
It did. Thank you very much. It did.
Yeah. Okay, Will, actually there is one more question in the chat box, if you can see it.
Okay, so is this the one about assessment? Is there any difference between assessment done in intercultural vis-a-vis multicultural English teaching, or are these basically the same? Well, I can talk about what assessment is like at the moment, certainly from my own experience. So assessment typically in ELT and in entrance exams for universities is based on the kind of international exams like IELTS or TOEFL, which are very much native speaker and monolingually orientated. So even though they claim to be international, by international they often mean different kinds of Englishes within the Anglophone world. So international means American, British and Australian English, which is not international. That's just 3 kinds of Anglophone Englishes. So assessment is typically, as I said, very native speaker orientated and very monolingual. So there's, I don't know of any exams that are tolerant of multilingualism in any way. When you do an English exam, you're only expected to use English. Now, I think that's really problematic because that's not how students use English in international environments. So you're basically giving students an exam which actually has very little validity for what the students need to do with English. And I'm not the first person to have noticed this. This is, I mean, I'm not a testing researcher, but testing researchers such as Constant Lung and Tim McNamara have been highlighting this problem for over a decade now, that there's a huge mismatch between how we assess English and how students and teachers and researchers actually use English. So it will, I mean, I think English language teaching assessment will have to change, but it's going to be very, very slow. It's going to be the slowest thing of all to change. I mean, it's hard enough changing curriculum and policy, which is beginning to change, but the testing industry is the slowest of all to change. So this is, you know, this is something that's going to take decades and decades, but there are people working on it. And Jennifer Jenkins and Constant Lung are developing alternative approaches to testing, which they're using in universities in London, I know. Myself and a colleague actually at Southampton are looking at incorporating kind of global English's perspectives on testing as well, and to see how you can develop measures of things like intelligibility without reference to native speaker norms. So there are people working on it, but it will take a long time to change, I think, because the testing industry is very, very slow to change. But I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful and optimistic. But I think that will be a change that will probably be something that I won't see in my own research career. I suspect that's something that's going to take decades and decades to change.
Okay, is there any questions?
And there is another question in the chat box. The question is, any prerequisite levels of English proficiency or integrating intercultural citizenship topics into a foreign language class to best benefit low English proficiency undergrad Thai students? Should this be studied?
Yeah, so that's again a good question, and a question that comes up a lot, not just in relation to intercultural citizenship, but in relation to general intercultural education. That is it suitable to bring this into the language classroom when you've got learners who are quite a basic stage or level? And my answer is very definitely yes. I mean, right from the beginning, you should make learners aware of the fact that if you're learning English, you're learning it as a global language for intercultural communication in multilingual environments. And also, of course, you don't need to discuss global citizenship just in English. I mean, something that I think is now well accepted is that the language classroom is a multilingual environment, and you should allow multilingual resources to be used. Now, to what extent, of course, is still a matter of debate, but I think there'll be very few classes which now insist on English only. Yeah, and if there is an English only policy, hopefully it's for a very restricted period of time and for a very specific purpose. But certainly when you're introducing concepts like intercultural citizenship, there's no reason why students can't discuss it in Thai. And also, I mean, obviously it's an English language class, so to do English aspects of it as well, but there's no reason why the level of proficiency should stop students talking about it. And particularly if you're talking about university level, the students are obviously cognitively going to develop, and in terms of cognition and attitudes and emotional development, going to be very advanced. So they'll certainly be capable of understanding concepts like intercultural citizenship. So I think it should be there right from the start as one of the core aims. You know, the reason you're learning a foreign language is, okay, it's to pass your exams, but if you've got any interest in the language and you actually want to use it, you're going to be using it in an environment where it's intercultural and the aim is an intercultural speaker.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Will. And actually, there is another one more question from Fadila. Okay, the question is: can language textbooks promote intercultural citizenship values?
Yes, I mean, again, I don't see why not. There's no reason why it can't be intercultural citizenship, and other kind of issues related to that can't be the content of textbooks. So obviously textbooks have reading exercises, textbooks have dialogues, interactions, things like that. There's no reason why any of those shouldn't be related to intercultural citizenship, and in actual fact I think it would make a very good content for textbooks and materials. So yes, I mean, thank you for the question, and hopefully that's quite a straightforward answer. Is yes, it is relevant, and yes, it would be very easy to incorporate. That could be the content of the reading materials, that could be the kind of tasks students are asked to do, etc. Yeah, and hopefully someone will go out there and write a book on it.
Thank you, Professor, for your explicit explanation to all questions. I'm sure that everyone have received their answer. And now we truly appreciate your being here with us. Thank you all again. And we also care about your opinion. So please complete the satisfaction survey. A link to the form is already provided in the chat box. You may click on the link. Now the evaluation link is provided in the chat box. Please take a moment to complete the satisfaction rate in order to have your feedback.
I think a few people have asked about the slides. Yusuf, I've given you a copy of the slides, yes?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I'm happy to share those with people. So if people email you, yeah, or you can email me directly. I think I left my email on the final slide. Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides from today.
Yeah. Okay, so Shada, while our participants are working on the assessment, Afnan, do you have any next event to make an announcement?
Yes, of course. We are going to make a presentation PR the next month's event, which will be held on November 9th. So the topic will be covered the characteristics of 21st century English language teachers by Dr. Willie from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Not only that, because my friends, my co-moderator has also got another event to promote as well. So
Yes.
another event of the month is,
and that's really interesting event indeed. And for those who are conducting your research and would love to know about the writing for publication, there is another must-go event to be held on upcoming November 26th. It is the writing for publication. This is what the next webinar look like. And the next webinar will be, we will have the invited speaker, Associate Professor Fan Fang from Shanghai University, China.
Okay.
If you are interested to join the next meeting, you can enroll for the event and serve your spot.
Okay, can you send us the link for the two events?
yes, of course.
So, a minute, please.
Excuse me, P, Sub, and everyone. For me in Cambodia, I cannot go to the link for registration in the chat box. I don't know why, because they say that I need a permission. It is forbidden. So I'm sorry, I cannot go to the link to evaluate for this webinar.
Okay, you don't have to worry about that. I will check with my staff and I will contact you personally later after the session.
ครับพี่ครับขอบคุณครับพี่
Okay, so for the first link I have provided is the form for the registration form, which is for the activity on November 9. And the second link will be the registration link for the second program of the next month. Yes.
Actually, I tried to send the PowerPoint today via the chat box, but it seems like I'm not able to send, maybe because of the file is too big. So maybe I will, if you need the PowerPoint, you can contact Will Baker directly, or you can contact to me. In that case, we are more than happy to send you the PowerPoint presentation today.
Yeah, I think you need to change it to a PDF to be able to send it to people.
Okay, sure.
But yes, people are welcome to email me directly as well, and I'll happily send you the slides.
Okay, so as everyone has done evaluating the forms, right? So can I have the link, the certificate link, please?
I just send the link for your collecting of the certificate.
Okay, thank you. And there is one request from the participant. Actually, can I have the proof? Can I get
Yes.
Proof's email, please?
Yes. Will, do you have the email? Then
I've just put my email in the chat box, so
okay.
if people want to email me.
All right, so now the e-certificate link is now provided in the chat box. If you now already complete the evaluation form, you may go directly through the link of the certificate and then fill in your personal detail to receive the certificate. And also, Professor Will Baker have already gave you the Gmail in the chat box. All right, everyone. So now it comes to an end of the session. I would love to take this opportunity to thank you, Associate Professor Will Baker, for your remarkable presentation on global citizenship, English medium education, and ELT. It is truly an excellent thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure that it is an enriching presentation ever that I have listened to. And I hope that everyone gain some more new perspective on language teaching as well. And also, I would love to thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for your time and your excellent cooperation. Your being here means a lot to us. And we hope to see you in the next event, which is going to be held in November. Thank you so much.
As a last but not least, formally, thank you once again to both Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker as a very renowned speaker for today's sessions, and also thank you very much to Assistant Professor Dr. Yusuf Bunsuk and all Western Department of PSU Patani Campus for having us as the moderator for today's event. And see you guys again next event. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution today, and we hope to invite you again maybe next year. And thank you very much everyone for your actively participation, and we hope to see you again for the next section in November. So maybe time to say goodbye for today. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you everybody, and I hope to see you again.
See you again.
Will. See you
Bye-bye.
again.
Hope to see you in Southampton.
Have a good day.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Afnan and Suchada, for your activity.
Most welcome. And I also
Most
seek
pressure
for,
and pleasure.
and I also seek for feedback if you have any feedback to comment or provide.
Yes, after this, you're gonna get lots of feedback from me. Mostly positive feedbacks, okay? Constructive comments, okay?
If so, can we have 2 tickets, flight ticket to Southampton, please?
Goodness.
Okay.
No, actually, can I have 5 for my beloved lecturers as well?
As long as you have enough money, yes, of course.
What are you trying to say? Self-funded, Afnan?
Self-funded, yes.
We do have money, but money don't have us.
I am not sure if I understand what you're trying to say, Suchada.
Can I stop recording?
You can stop recording for now, yes.